So we've got a new table. First question is why? Like, why would we do this to ourselves? We already have one table. And the answer for that is actually sample size. As we've talked about before, I need to have a certain number of people involved in order for the sampling distribution to be normal. That is, in order to have things have this really beautiful distribution to it. And the problem with this is that a lot of times my sample size isn't big enough and I'm dealing with averages. For instance, if I want to find out the average number of days a mother breastfeeds, or I want to find out the average amount of weight change in anorexic women. Well, it's hard to get people to commit to a study like that, whereas asking people their opinion and getting a proportion tends to be relatively easy. So in a lot of cases with average problems, we don't have the sample size necessary to give us a normal distribution, which means the normal distribution is out. And if the normal distribution doesn't work, then we've got to come up with something else. This is that something else. Let's talk about what it is. It's what we call a t-table, or a student t. Now, the reason for this is super interesting, and so I hope you check out the video on why it is. For here, we're going to kind of gloss over it. So this t-table here is really nice in that it adjusts for sample size. And the way it does that is we have what's called degrees of freedom, or DF for short. Degrees of freedom is calculated in a couple different ways depending on what type of problem you're doing. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and leave the formula blank. It'll adjust depending on if we're doing 1 or 2 samples, if we're looking at regression lines, or if we're looking at just means. But the important thing to realize is that I find my degrees of freedom and the way to adjust my table on this left-hand column here. So when I go to use the t-table, the first thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and find my degree of freedom row. Now, in some cases, the degrees of freedom row is really clear. For instance, if I had degrees of freedom 6, I would be looking at this row right here. If I had degrees of freedom 100, I'd be looking at this one right here. Sometimes, though, it's not as clear, and that is sometimes it might not be on the table. If it's not on the table, then we need to adjust somehow, and we'll adjust that by going ahead and always round down. So, for instance, if I have degrees of freedom 37, well, 37 is not on the table. In fact, 37 would be like right in between here, right? I go ahead and I always round down, so I would use 30 on the table. The next video we'll talk about why we round down and exactly what the t distribution is doing.